sorry for that. I'm sure that the talks were amazing, and sorry, but yeah. And also, I changed my title. I'm not going to talk about perpetrators' motivation. I realized that that the topic was really the validity of Milgram's experiment. And so I'm mostly going to talk about Milgram experiments. So these experiments are often considered very important findings illustrating the power of the situation on human agency. And they have often been referred to by philosophers, and especially philosophers of social sciences or philosophers of psychology, who wanted to downplay the relevance of intentional belief desire explanations. But recently, and also less recently, as I'm going to show, concerns have been raised about their validity. So what is the validity of an experiment for a psychologist? That's a very important concept in psychology and in the methodology of psychology. They say that an experiment or a test is valid to the extent that it really measure what it purports to measure. And as we are going to see, it's kind of problematic in the case of Milgram's experiments. It's not completely clear that these experiments really measure obedience. So I'm going to discuss these concerns. And I'm also going to raise a related question, which is also a validity question, but which has more to do with the scientific legitimacy of the construct posited by Milgram, with this notion of obedience as a psychological property. And we'll see that it's not completely clear either that this construct is scientifically legitimate. So the take-home message is quite modest, I think, in this talk. I think that the take-home message is that we should be very careful in interpreting the experiments. And I think that philosophers have not always been very careful. So I guess even if the aim of my talk is modest, it could be useful. Okay, so first I will say a few words about philosophical uses of Milgram. Milgram's results have been mostly used in the recent philosophical literature to downplay the relevance of reasons, of intentional belief desire explanations. They are almost always cited along with Zimbardo's infamous Stanford experiment and Ash research on conformity. And they are taken as suggesting that contextual factors are more relevant than explicit attitudes to explaining certain kinds of behavior. Zimbardo, Ash, and Milgram's results are taken to show that the best explanation of human actions has more to do with subtle situational factors than with the intentional states of agents. So let us turn now to some illustrations of these philosophical uses. First, I'm going to quote a book by a political philosopher, Michael Hummer, a libertarian, who uses Milgram results a lot in his book, The Problem of Political Authority. So in this book, in this book, Hummer considers as a proven fact stemming from Milgram's results that, I quote him, the average human being is far more likely to commit heinous crimes in the name of obedience to authority than he is to rashly disobey unjustified commands of an authority figure. And he also says that literally millions have died because of the widespread disposition to obey unjust commands. Okay, the conclusion is that we shouldn't trust governments, neither should we trust the state. So on this interpretation, Milgram's experiment revealed a hidden disposition to blindly obey authority figures. And this disposition is supposed to be contextually triggered, largely independently from the agent's personal beliefs and preferences. As witnessed in this quote, just as none of Milgram's subjects would have decided on their own to go out and electrocute anyone, very few Germans would have decided on their own to go out murdering Jews. That's another quote by Hummer. So Hummer suggests that the obedient subjects are so deluded by the presence of an authority figure that they felt compelled to act by the sheer authority of the experimenter, without any good reason to do so, and without any knowledge of the true explanations of their actions. So that's a really strong claim when you think about it. Hummer takes for granted that Milgram's experiments have a huge explanatory relevance for social and political science, an assumption which is often made, and endorses a very strong situationist interpretation of the experiments to the effect that human beings can be easily manipulated by authority figures, independently of their values, independently of their reasons, beliefs, preferences, etc. Okay. A strong reading of Ash, Zimbardo, and Milgram's finding is also endorsed by Paul Roth in several articles. Ash worked on conformities interpreted as demonstrating, I quote Roth, the amazing willingness of people to simply assimilate the norms of the situations in which they find themselves. So like Hummer, Roth claims that Ash and Milgram's results have explanatory relevance for perpetrator studies. So in this talk, I won't say anything about Zimbardo's experiment, except that I'm convinced by Le Texier work that Zimbardo misrepresented his data to such an extent that they are scientifically meaningless. So I don't think there is really much to say. I'm sure that's controversial, but anyway, I won't say anything about Zimbardo. But I would like to say a few things about Ash before turning to Milgram, because I think it's really a textbook case of a psychologist whose views have been quite deeply distorted, especially in textbooks. So that's actually interesting as a kind of introduction to Milgram. So I'm sure that you know Ash experiment. It's a very well-known experiment. Ash presented 3 lines of different lengths to subjects and asked them to match these lines to a first one. And as can be seen on the picture, which is from Wikipedia, one of the lines very clearly matches the first one. But in spite of this, many participants gave a false answer, 30% of participants, which also incidentally means that 70% gave the correct answer, which usually is completely neglected. But I mean, so why did they do that? Because without the participants knowing it, some of the other subjects who had already replied and whose behavior could be observed by the participants were actually confederates, who were asked to give a plainly incorrect answer. So basically, the idea is that this incorrect answer influences the participants, and that's the reason why at least some of them give a wrong answer. So that's very often taken now to illustrate the power of the situation. But is that really the case? It is indeed presented in most psychology textbooks. I quote one of these textbooks, a textbook by Moscovici. I quote, one of the most dramatic illustrations of conformity, of blindly going along with the group. But actually, if you reread the original paper, which I encourage you to do because it's really very interesting to read the original papers, that was not Ash's interpretation at all. Ash's interpretation was quite opposite to this interpretation. He himself concludes, I quote, that the minority estimates remained preponderantly accurate. So he insisted in his conclusion on the independence, not on the conformity, but on the independence of the participant. And I quote again that despite the stress of the given conditions, a substantial proportion of individuals retained their independence through thought. Actually, if you read, for instance, his 52 book on social psychology, it's not clear at all that he endorsed a situationist reading of the experiment. Quite the contrary, actually. He wrote that independence or yielding were functionally dependent on relatively enduring character differences, in particular those pertaining to the person's social relations. So a very I mean, it's not a situationist, a strong situationist interpretation of the findings. So let's turn to Milgram now, and that's the core of my talk. That's the most interesting part, at least in my mind. So, so here is what writes about Milgram. I quote wrote, a close analysis of Milgram's work and Zimbardo's establishes that the situational analysis accounts in all essentials for the number of perpetrators and their otherwise incomprehensible brutality. Their experiments compellingly demonstrate that the conformity effect suffices to predict both the extent of participation and the sadistic enthusiasm that individuals invest in roles to which accidents of experimental design have assigned them. So, of course, a key assumption here is that Milgram's results show that obedience behavior can be predicted in some situations largely independently from the agent's beliefs and motivations. And that's a presupposition that I think should be discussed. So I think that the explanatory relevance of Milgram's results for perpetrator studies should really be re-examined. It's not clear that actually, as I'm going to argue, the experiment really show that the obedience of a subject can be easily predicted from a situation. So my argument is going to be that to be explanatory relevant to the perpetrator studies, to the Holocaust studies, Milgram's experiments need to have internal validity. They need to be internally valid. I'm going to explain what this means. And also his theoretical posits needs to be scientifically legitimate. What he intends to measure needs to exist, because if this doesn't exist, or if we have reasons to doubt that it exists, of course, the results are not explanatory relevant. And I think that we both have serious reasons to question the internal validity of the experiment, but also that we have reasons to question the scientific legitimacy of his main assumptions, that both are problematic. Even the legitimacy of the assumptions are debatable. And my conclusion is that it's quite unclear that the experiments have explanatory relevance, or at least this should be this should be discussed. It's not clear. It shouldn't be presupposed. Okay, so the first thing I would like to say is that the experiment, Milgram's experiment, were initially designed to measure something, to measure the degree of conformity and obedience displayed by subjects. And initially, the idea was to compare conformity in Americans and Germans. And because he was really surprised by the results, it changed. I mean, I think he dropped this aspect of the research, but that's what he had in mind initially, to have a measure of obedience in a certain context. The simulated shock generator, and the word simulated here is very important because it's not really, of course, a shock generator. No shock is produced, fortunately, in the experiment. It's just make-believe. It's okay, so the simulated shock generator is conceived as an obedience measuring instrument, with shock levels starting at 15 volts and increasing in 15 volts increments up to 450 volts. And the main assumption is the following. Milgram assumed that a disposition to obey could be quantified by the level of shock a participant was willing to administer in the experiments. I quote his 63 paper. A quantitative value is assigned to the subject's performance based on the maximum intensity shock he is willing to administer before he refuses to participate further. Thus, for any particular subject and for any particular experimental condition, the degree of obedience may be specified with a numerical value. So you see that the measurement procedure is really at the core of the experiment. It's really very important to the experiments. Okay, so now what do psychologists mean by valid in this context? What do we mean when we ask whether a proposed measure is valid or not, or whether a construct is valid or not? What we mean, the important question is to know whether the measure tracks a certain psychological property, which is a property that it purports to measure. In my paper, I use a useful distinction which was drawn by Stone, by a philosopher of psychology, between construct validity and construct legitimacy. On Stone's view, we consider that a measure has construct validity, so that's the first important concept, and that's the concept which is the most commonly used by psychologists. So a construct has a construct validity if we have sufficient evidence that the measure tracks the construct. That is, again, the word construct may be a bit disturbing, but for a philosopher of science, a construct is just an unobservable property. And so when we talk about a construct, we talk about a theoretical concept, basically, and the property that this concept denotes. So in the case of Milgram, let's say the concept of an obedient behavior, something like that. My definition will be, so I borrow this definition to Stone. It's not my own definition, and she proposes to define construct validity in the following way. A measure M of some construct C is construct valid if and only if we are sufficiently justified in believing M tracks C. So the question I'm going to ask about Milgram experiments is whether we are sufficiently justified to believe that that the measure that he gives tracks obedience, and I don't think it's the case. So I don't think that the construct has construct validity. And it's also interesting to discuss the construct legitimacy of a concept, of a construct. A construct C is legitimate if and only if the theory that posits this construct is sufficiently justified. So that's a more metaphysical question, construct legitimacy. It's a question about the existence, the very existence of non-observable property. It's important to note that a construct can be valid without having a scientific legitimacy. Let us consider, for instance, as an illustration, the measure of zodiac signs in astrology. These measures only depend on the measure of birth dates. And the measure of birth dates is really very accurate. We have no problem measuring birth dates. It's very easy. And so as a consequence, measuring zodiac signs is very easy too. The measures are accurate and reliable, so the construct has construct validity. But I think that nobody would say that the astrology is a legitimate scientific theory. So most people think that the posits simply don't exist, the theoretical assumptions which are made by these theories. And so there is no construct legitimacy. There is maybe construct validity, but no construct legitimacy. So now in my discussion, I'm first going to discuss construct validity and then construct legitimacy. Okay, so why do I think that there is a validity question, a construct validity question, which should be discussed about Milgram's data, about Milgram's results? First, because again, the shock machine is actually a simulated shock machine. It can work as an instrument measuring obedience only if subjects falsely believe that they are really administrating shocks. So this really depends on the beliefs of the subject. Something that which is not completely straightforward to control, to observe, to manipulate. So this is highly problematic. And this is highly problematic also because the setup was not completely credible or even completely consistent. It included a dramatic staging, which was designed to induce a strong false belief in the reality of the shocks. The Confederate would emit screams and painful sounds, for instance, but simultaneously, the scientists would assure the teacher that the shocks were not dangerous, which is, when you think about it, very strange and not really believable. I mean, I guess that the participants had, yeah, they should have thought that the situation was really weird. Okay, and Gina Perry, who is an historian of psychology, wrote a wonderful book on Milgram experiment, in which she reports that actually the participant expressed doubts, and that the more they expressed doubt, the less ready they were observed to comply. And these data that are used by Gina Perry in her book, unfortunately, were not published by Milgram. So in a way, he selected his data. He didn't publish the data which were problematic from a methodological point of view, which is not surprising. I mean, a lot of people do that. That's not a very good practice, but yeah, he selected the data. In this regard, Perry highlighted the presence in the experiment, in the data, of a very probable confounder. A confounder is a causal factor which renders the measure invalid. Since, at least in some cases, participants might have chosen to inflict a high level of shock because they disbelieved the reality of the staging. So not because they were obedient, not at all, but because they were skeptical. They were skeptical. And actually, Perry published some interviews with the subject. So for instance, subject 408 said, I found it hard to believe that Yale would allow a paid subject to absorb such punishment. The description of the control board was a bit far-fetched. The learner's poor answers were not completely believable. He seemed too intelligent to stumble. Okay. Perry's interpretation was also confirmed in a recent paper, which was published in 2020, based on an unpublished study by Milgram student Taketo Murata. And the data were not published either by Milgram. But the data from this study suggest that the perception of pain is actually correlated with defiance, while subject skepticism is correlated with obedience. So this confirms that there might really be a confounder in the data. And if there is a confounder, the experiment is not construct valid. In a fascinating interview with Perry, Murata himself considered Milgram's data to be confounded. I quote Murata, there are a lot of other things that are beyond this collection of data. It could be something else entirely from what's involved. In medical terms, it might not be the drug that is doing this. So Murata himself, looking a posteriori on the data, evolves that they could be explained by the confounder. Okay, that's quite interesting finding, I think. Independently from this confounder, Perry's work also raises doubt about whether the experiments really measured obedience or something else entirely different. The concept of an obedience behavior is neither very well defined nor very precisely operationalized by Milgram. And actually, as early as 1972, Don Mixon, who is a psychologist who tried to replicate the experiment. So Mixon argued that what Milgram had measured was not obedience, but trust in experts. So trust was rather than obedience. And when you think about it, for instance, the advertisement used to recruit subjects for the experiment said that participants were needed to help us, I quote, complete a scientific study of memory and learning. So there was actually a selection bias, a selection effect, because the subject who were selected to take part in the experiment were subjects who wanted to help scientists find new interesting data. Maybe they were more interested in science than the average person. And they may have had a disposition to trust experts. So that's also problematic. Okay. On Mixon's view, it was reasonable to expect the participant to assume that safeguards protecting the physical integrity of subject were in place. I quote Mixon in his original paper, 72 paper, it may be possible to account for the obedient behavior in terms of background expectations. That is, given the experimental context, no matter what occurs, it is never impossible for a subject to assume safeguards are in place. And in an interview with Perry, he also said that Milgram found just the opposite of what he thought he found. Nothing about subjects' behavior is evil. In fact, people go to great lengths, will suffer great distress to be good. People got caught up in trying to be good and trusting the expert. I'm not saying that his interpretation is correct. I don't know. I have no idea. But I think that the question he raises from a methodological point of view is completely correct. It could be right. Maybe it's not right, but it could be. So, and there are also recent confirmations of this interpretation. This interpretation has been confirmed in an analysis of the post-experimental justification the subjects themselves gave for their obedience behavior. And that's reported in a paper by Hollander and Churovets in 2017. In this study, the authors conclude that most obedient participants, I quote, continued because they didn't think the situation was dangerous, despite appearances to the contrary. And another confirmation could also be found in the rhetorical interpretation that Stephen Gibson recently gave of Milgram's results and data. Very interesting interpretation. Gibson, who talked to us in December, he gave a very interesting talk. He insists in his interpretation that subjects very often tried to argue out, as he says, out of the experiment, that they try to give arguments to the experimenter to stop, and that the experimenter also gives arguments, which, I mean, seems to confirm Mixon's insights, basically. Okay, so the upshot of this discussion is that we have reasons to be skeptical about the construct validity of the experiments. But is the construct itself that Milgram tried to measure scientifically valid? Is it justified? Are we justified in thinking that the unobservable psychological processes postulated by Milgram really exist? Actually, that the unobservable he tried to measure were not scientifically justified was objected to Milgram right from the outset, as soon as he submitted his first paper in 61 to the Journal of Personality. The paper was rejected, actually. And because the paper was rejected, first it was rejected and he submitted it to another journal and it was published. but first it was rejected, and the editor of the review sent a very interesting letter to Milgram, which is quoted by Perry. That's again drawing from Perry's fantastic work. And here is what the editor says, I quote, "You are apparently able to produce behavior which is in some sense shocking, but you have no clear theory, and therefore the psychological processes leading them to the obedient act remain a mystery." So the problem which is raised here is not a problem of construct validity, it's a problem of construct legitimacy. What the editor is saying is that he's not sure that what Milgram is trying to measure exists, and it's not completely clear what he's trying to measure. Okay, so contrary to Ash, Milgram clearly endorsed a kind of situationism. Here is a quote where he endorses this position. He says that, that's a text where he gives explanation to one of the participants, post hoc explanation to a participant in the experiment. And here what he says to the participant that situations control behavior. There is a tendency to think that everything a person does is due to the feelings or ideas within the person. However, scientists show that actions depend equally on the situation in which a man finds himself. In the studies in which you took part, we were interested in seeing how changes in the situation would affect the degree to which people obey the requests of the experimenter. But of course, so I think that's a very interesting quote. But at the same time, the quote doesn't say anything really that interesting, because saying that situations influence behavior, I think it's not really controversial. It's quite trivial. Of course it does. I mean, there are obviously situational causal factors that influence behavior, and I don't think that anybody disagrees with that. There is agreement on that. The real challenge is to identify the relevant factors, to describe them, to pinpoint them, and to discover what causal roles they play, and also, of course, to assess their importance. And that's, I think, the problematic part in his research. Also, the part which is still extremely interesting, because when I'm raising doubts about the validity, of course, that doesn't imply that the results are not interesting. They're very interesting. They're fascinating. Okay, so in 1974, in his book on obedience, Milgram exposed his own version of Hannah Arendt's idea of sheer thoughtlessness, the theory of the agentic state. So he postulated a kind of unobservable, the agentic state, and his assumption, an agent entering this state view himself as an instrument for carrying out the wishes of others. And also he said that for this agent, the evaluative mechanism is wholly absent. It's wholly absent. So that's interesting, because in the 1974 book, he tried to answer the objection that, well, that from a theoretic point of view, what he was trying to measure was not completely clear, and he put forward an assumption. So now I would like to discuss this assumption. And first, I would like to note that it's not very plausible for prima facie reasons. I think that the concept of an agentic state doesn't make a lot of theoretical sense, especially from an evolutionary perspective. That's something which has been really emphasized in a recent book on gullibility, Hugo Mercier's book, Not Born Yesterday. Really, and Mercier emphasizing in this very powerful charge against the view that human beings are innate conformists. He emphasizes that being gullible and easy to influence doesn't lead to adaptive behavior in a social species. So that's not something that should be presumed, at least from a theoretical point of view. Maybe we are gullible, but that's not something that we should presuppose. If that's really what you think, you should prove it. You should give evidence. And actually, according to Mercier, at least, recent evidence suggests that human beings are epistemically vigilant rather than gullible. So Milgram's main assumption is not doesn't seem very plausible from a theoretical perspective, especially from a naturalist's perspective. In a recent review on the validity of Milgram's experiment, Alexander Haslam and Stephen Reicher conclude that, I quote them, contrary to the widespread claim that people obey orders from authority, which is routinely taken as a key message to be gleaned from Milgram's research, there is thus compelling evidence that giving people an order is one of the least effective ways of securing their compliance. So not only is there no independent empirical evidence for evaluative mechanism being wholly absent in obedient context, but Milgram's recorded data are inconsistent with this view. Very far from being compelled by the sheer authority of the experimenter, the subjects were epistemically alert. They were constantly trying to interpret the experimenter's intention, to assess their moral value, and to argue their way out of the experiment when the feeling of cognitive dissonance became unbearable. Okay, something else I think that we should consider in this debate is, and here I quote Daniel Kahneman, the social priming train wreck. I think that we should consider this context we are in now with the reproducibility crisis, while assessing Milgram's more theoretical ideas about the power of the situation. So, according to Kahneman, priming research in social psychology have recently derailed in a train wreck. Social priming refers to the idea that subtle cues, often situational, can causally affect behavior. An idea that, of course, is consistent with Milgram's core intuition that situations control behavior. But it would be an understatement to say that in this field, expectations have been disappointed. And I will just give, it's a little bit anecdotal. I'm sorry about that, but I think that it's quite interesting. Two quotes, because something quite funny about that is that Kahneman himself, in his bestseller book, Thinking Fast and Slow, first wholly endorsed the social priming researches. He gave a very optimistic review of this research. I quote Kahneman, and then he made a U-turn. He completely changed his mind in a few months. So the first quote is an extract from Thinking Fast and Slow, chapter 4, and he says, quote, when I describe priming studies to audience, the reaction is often disbelief. Questions are probably cropping up in your mind as well. How is it possible for such trivial manipulations of the context to have such large effects? The idea we should focus on is that disbelief is not an option, The results are not made up, nor are they statistical flukes. You have no choice but to accept that the measured conclusions of these studies are true. And 6 months later, he said just the opposite in an open letter to John Bargh, which was, I think, published in Nature, but I wasn't able before the talk to really track the reference in Nature, but I think it was published in Nature. So I quote this text, and you will see that really that it says the opposite. Questions have been raised about the robustness of priming results. The storm of doubts is fed by several sources, including the recent exposure of fraudulent researchers, general concerns with replicability that affect many disciplines, multiple reported failures to replicate salient results in the priming literature, and the growing belief in the existence of a pervasive file drawer problem. File drawing, it's selecting data. That's what Milgram did, actually. So for all these reasons, right or wrong, your field is now the poster child of doubts about the integrity of psychological research. A very strong word. But so those were very strong words, but actually 10 years after this letter, I think it seems clear that Kahneman was quite right. Replication problems have loomed large and have affected major studies in social priming. Ironically, I must say, the studies quoted in Kahneman's chapter very often failed to replicate themselves. So that's quite funny. The studies that he quoted, more than half failed to replicate. So more than half. That's.
I think you
sorry.
Should, I think.
Okay. I'm going to conclude now. Okay. So Milgram's claim that the situation can make the feeling of responsibility disappear is certainly an exaggeration. His intuition that our sense of moral agency can be contextually modulated, however, deserves to be looked at more closely. And that's what I would like to do in the conclusion of this talk. Our sense of agency might be a causal mediator, explaining why subjects show less control of their actions' outcomes in coercive situations. In 2 studies using intentional binding as an implicit measure of the sense of agency, we will discuss what this measure is if you want. Intentional binding refers to an effect, which is that the subjective perception of the temporal interval between an action and its sensory consequences are compressed when the action is intentional. And it's more compressed the more the action is intentional. So if you are coerced to do something, you can measure it using using intentional binding as an implicit measure. So that's what they did in two studies, and they observed that there was a reduced sense of responsibility in coercive situations, which could look like a confirmation of at least some of Milgram's intuition. I think we should still be very careful, because this reduced sense of responsibility can also be detected in the person who gives the orders. So it's detected in the person who receives the order, but also in the person who gives the order. So there is a modulation of the sense of agency in some contexts, in some situations, but the observed modulation might be related to the presence of other agents more than to obedience. It could be related to the demands of social cooperation more than to the coercive nature of a situation. If correct, this assumption would explain why a reduced sense of responsibility seems to be correlated with taking decisions in the context of group behavior, something that has been surmised to be the case by prominent researchers in social sciences, and in particular in perpetrator studies, people like Browning, for instance. I think that's something which is interesting, is that Browning, the core intuition of Browning, I think, is that there is something like group think, an influence of the group, and basically, I think it's very plausible. That's not what was argued by Milgram, however. So, but yeah, that's still very interesting. It is consistent with recent evidence suggesting that social context reduces agents' sense of agency. Okay, maybe I will skip this slide and just say that, yeah, there is a reduced monitoring of action outcomes in social settings.
Vraiment, tu conclus si tu veux qu'il y ait une discussion ensuite.
Yes, I conclude, yes. Okay. So my conclusion is that it's doubtful that Milgram's experiments are internally valid. They might have measured skepticism, trust, or other factors independent of obedience. The scientific legitimacy of Milgram's main construct is also debatable. It seems true that social context, especially coercive situations, can induce a reduced sense of responsibility. And the sense of agency, the subjective sense of agency, could be a causal mediator here. None of these recent findings confirm a strong situationist reading of Milgram. The train wreck of social priming studies should remind us that pinpointing strong contextual effect is very hard, actually. If situational causal factors modulate obedience, which is plausible and which is an interesting assumption, these factors are probably subtle and can probably be reversed by norms favoring accountability, which I think is good news. Okay, thank you for your attention.
So many thanks for this very, very stimulating, rich talk. I hope they will be interesting. So
I stop sharing the screen. Okay.
So okay, I see. So maybe Paul. Paul.
Yeah, Pascal, one part of your talk puzzled me. You seem to acknowledge at several points that the result of these experiments, is real. That is, you were challenging the antecedent conditions that Milgram posits, but you seem quite willing at a number of points to grant the legitimacy of the outcome that you get a certain type of behavior if you construct certain types of situations. But you call that trivial, and that shocked me, not in Milgram's sense, because it seems to me, far from being trivial, that's in fact the take-home measure. I mean, let me give a very so you said if it's not internally valid, it's not externally valid. But that just seems on purely logical grounds not correct, right? The antecedent can be false and the consequent can still be true, right? You still have this effect. The antecedent conditions you're positing to account for it might not turn out to be the correct antecedent conditions. But that doesn't mean the effect goes away. It doesn't mean, in fact, you can't continue to elicit that effect, without knowing, right, exactly what it is that's triggering the behavior that you're eliciting. Maybe you're trying to sell something, you can get people to buy in certain sorts of situations, but you have no idea of the internal measures. You can just model it. So anyway, I'd like you to clarify why it is you think you can hold on to the reality of the effect and think that this is trivial. In fact, it seems to me the effect is really what what's the take home here? Am I being clear?
Yeah, it's very clear. Thank you. I mean, it really depends on what you are saying. If what you are saying is that it's sufficient to know the situation to predict the behavior, I think that's incorrect. It's not sufficient. So knowing the situation in most interesting cases is not sufficient to be able to predict the behavior. But if what you are saying is that there is an influence of the situation and the behavior, I agree, and I think that everybody agrees. Of course, there is an influence. Of course, for instance, the persons who are practicing violin are practicing violin in some kind of an environment and not in other kinds of environments, and that's a fact. So there is a correlation between the practice of violin and situational factors, and I think that's true in general. I don't have anything against situationism. I think it's the core ideas are very plausible, and I think it's crucial to insist that situational factors can be causally explanatory in some contexts. But I think that the really difficult part of the project is to pinpoint the relevant causal factors. And I'm not sure that's what Milgram did. So when you say that an experiment can be internally invalid and externally valid, that's very surprising, because of course, if there is a confounder in the data, you can't generalize and apply the data to another field of research. I mean, if the data are confounded by a causal factor, you can't, that's something that you can't do. I mean, as a philosopher of science, I wouldn't agree that you can do that. So maybe we disagree, but no, I think that the internal validity is very important. It's really crucial. Maybe I forgot some parts of your question, or did I answer your questions?
Well, no. I mean, I think I'll take this up in my own talk. I think to some extent we're talking past each other. I really don't care, actually, if Milgram's hypothesis about obedience is correct or not. I don't. The philosophical psychology doesn't interest me. What interests me is the ability to produce an effect.
Yeah, fine. So then, yeah, maybe. I mean, I am interested in the internal validity of the experiment. So, yeah, fine.
Isabelle?
Well, thank you very much, Pascal. I had some remarks a little bit in your lines. The the first one would be about the Zimbardo experiment, where there have been more recent research. I forgot to the name of the person who wrote the book about how much the Zimbardo experiment has been not scientific, how much he interfered into the experiment. And so it's even less plausible and scientific than Milgram's experiment. What strikes me in the some use of the Milgram, I mean, yesterday you were not there, but I was talking about this illusion of an explanation that we have been going from Browning to Milgram to Arendt, and end up in this idea that we would have the final answer, is that at best, it shows a correlation in numbers that what you show by putting together Milgram and Browning is that you have supposedly the same percentage of people who are going to be to shoot or torture with pleasure, and the same percentage who are going to refuse. That's all. It doesn't tell you more. It doesn't tell you anything about the motivations, because what the Milgram experiment doesn't show is the type of motivation and feeling that you need to have to come back the next day. Because all the cases of Milgram experiment were never cases where at the end of the day, you open the machine and the person is really dead. You can touch him and you can really check that he's dead. So you never have the experience of someone who really killed and was there the next morning to start again. And the motivations, so it doesn't tell you anything about the motivations for that. And the change of motivation that you can have in killing every day, which is something that Browning addresses, that a lot of people addresses, which is the change, the temporal change in the psychology of the person, of the killers. So in the best case, for me, it's just correlations of number, percentages, but it doesn't tell you anything about what it is to kill on a regular basis every day and to start again the next morning. And particularly, it's for me a little bit, part of our conversations are a little bit weird because there are those debates, at least among French historians, are kind of old. No one is any longer talking about Gourdagen. However, there has been a lot of work in France over the last years about several hypotheses. And one, I'm not saying it's the best, and I have a lot of criticism against it. It's about the idea of culture de guerre, culture of war, how wars brutalize individuals and how the Holocaust could be partly explained by the brutalization of war during the First World War in Germany. I'm not saying this hypothesis is right, but it just points to the specific psychology, the specific feeling that you have in a war, which are fear. And it's something which is pretty strong among Browning's men. They stick together because they are afraid. Then there is esprit de corps, which is something you mentioned, Pascal, but which is very strong in armies and which is part of the education of being a good military. So you have a lot of other feelings which are completely different from what Milgram's address. So until the point, I mean, I share your doubts about not only the validity, but mainly the relevance of Milgram experiment for Holocaust and genocide context. Because until the day where we actually prove that the person is dead and they come back the next day, for me, it's of no relevance.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your remarks. I think I agree with everything. So yes, the correlation, I think the correlation, maybe that's, I don't know, frankly, I don't know. Yeah, maybe that's interesting.
It's something which is actually, it's part of the end of Browning's book.
Yeah, I know. And by the way, I really love Browning's book. It's one of the best books I've read on the...
No, the only bad
really
part...
like Browning very much. But
yeah.
So, and I think that now, currently, Browning would agree with my criticisms. I think he would say, yeah, okay, maybe I was wrong about Milgram. Maybe.
And Arendt also.
I think that's explicitly what he's saying now, that he was wrong about Milgram, but still he thinks that there is something about groupthink, about the context of taking decisions, taking very difficult decisions in a coercive context, in a group context, which is important. And I think that this has been confirmed in some recent studies, the studies that I mentioned at the end of my talk. Maybe I was too quick, but too fast. But yeah, these studies, I think, are relevant to the discussion. By the way, one of these studies studied obedience in a military context. So that's exactly what you were saying. They studied obedience and they found that actually, that there was a modulation, a situational modulation, but the modulation was quite subtle and could be also influenced by cultural factors. So cultural factors also seem to be very important.
But I think we have the time for 1 minute question from Nigel and 1 minute response by you, Pascal.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to take Paul's point a little bit further. So, I mean, so Mixon's reinterpretation supposedly was based on his own experimental evidence, whereby he got actors to self-consciously reenact the Milgram experiment, which kind of, for me, is reminiscent of the relationship between the BBC prison experiment and Zimbardo's original. But picking up Paul's point, even if Mixon is right that it's trust and not obedience, from the standpoint, as it were, of the learner, if I was the learner, it wouldn't matter much to me if it was trust that induced the teacher to deliver all those shocks, or obedience. And I think it's actually an important point. I don't actually accept Mixon's rereading at all. But if he is correct, I think if we look at the whole situation of how the so-called final solution came about, with Jewish victims themselves not daring to believe what the evidence was suggesting, and the whole army of different participants doing what they did because they had some trust in either, I don't know, their professional mission or the government or the people or whatever, then I think we can see trust playing a pretty dangerous role there as well. So I think that I offer this as as what Paul's point leads to practically.
Okay, fine. I mean, I wouldn't bet on that. I mean, I wouldn't, if really what you are saying is that a study can be construct invalid, but still useful to predict behaviors, that's fine, but not with me. I mean, and I think that many psychologists are going to disagree.
It's fine, but is a good conclusion because we need to go on if we want to finish not too late. So many thanks, Pascal, for your very, very stimulating.
Thank you for the comments. Thank you very much.
So maybe we could take 2 minutes break, if it's okay with you all, so that we don't finish too late. We could go back in at 27, whatever hour is yours. Or 20, 20, yeah. Paul, I make you co-host if you want to share something, or you want to share a slide now?
No, just whenever you're ready to have me start, let me know.
Okay, okay.